Welcome to the Grant Talks podcast, and this is the Meet Your Trainer episode of the Grant Talks Conversations with Colleagues. I am Lucy Morgan from My Fed Trainer, and I'm here to introduce one of my colleagues, Rachel Werner. For those of you who have admired my unicorn mug that I love to start my trainings with, a little behind the scenes fact, this was a gift from Rachel Werner many years ago. And I've had a lot of comments on my unicorn mug. And I know when I got it, I thought to myself, this is somebody I really want to talk to more, because definitely understands that whole unicorn and rainbows part of grants. Well, if your paths have not yet crossed with Rachel Werner, let me tell you a little bit about her grant journey. She began her career as a New York City teacher in the public schools, and she parlayed that into a 2-decade career in the public sector. She was a nonprofit fundraiser, she was a grant writer, she's been a grant manager and a management consultant for the federal government, so pretty wide range of experience. She is the owner and CEO of RBW Strategy, which is a full service grant firm in Maryland. Up there where right by the Chesapeake Bay and the DC area, which is very good location. She also, in addition to her GPC, which is a grant professional certified from the Grant Professional Association, she has a certificate in grant management and is a certified project management professional. So welcome, Rachel. I'm so excited to get to introduce you not only to the Grant Talks audience, but also the MyFed Trainer audience.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure being here because I always love talking about the grant stories because that's where you can really dig into it. So I'm happy to be here and talk more.
Well, let's jump right into it. Tell us a little bit about your professional background and how you got to where you are today.
Oh gosh, so that's quite a journey because nobody grows up and says, I'm going to be a grants professional, maybe my kids will because they see me doing it, but I don't think so. So my first job, as you mentioned, right out of college, I have a teaching certificate. So I taught in New York City, taught first grade in the New York City public schools, realized fairly quickly that that was not the right place for me, but it was probably the hardest job I've ever had. And so I think I have so much respect for teachers, and I gained a lifelong understanding of a different type of work than I ever did before. And then I went to graduate school, had got my master's in public administration. And so started to learn more about nonprofits. I thought nonprofit management. I thought I wanted to be an executive director. Then I worked in nonprofits and said, oh, no. I don't know if I really want to be an executive director, but you always learn more from the things that you don't want to do than the things that you actually get accolades from. And then I started to get into fundraising and grants. And so for the past 20 years, I was doing pre-award, and then I parlayed that into post-award support as a management consultant. When we moved down from New York City to the DC area, that's when I was working as a management consultant helping federal grantees. So it was a very interesting transition to get both sides of the aisle. And then I launched my business after I had my son. And here we are today, 10 years later. So
very cool. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that there's some level of the professional education that you had that really positioned you to become the grant source matter expert that you are today?
I will say that most of it was boots on the ground learning. I really do feel like so much of what I have learned and what others have learned is just based on trial and error and getting in there and digging in. And I do think from the certifications perspective, I am a certified grants professional. So that certainly is, validation of the understanding of the work in the space. And also, when I was working previously as a management consulting, I did receive the project management professional certification because I still reference those different areas now because there's a lot of things that kind of relate to work and grants compliance, like risk assessment and RACI charts. If you don't know what that is, that's a whole other conversation, but all of these different kinds of things that can really benefit. So a lot of that thinking has helped me as a professional.
Yeah,
So.
and I think anytime you're working with grants, well, really so many aspects of life, that whole discipline of project management is so important. I was just talking the other day to someone who kind of dropped into the deep end of the pool, taking over in a state for their grant management when someone had, I don't know if they had retired or something, and having no systems in place. And so trying to have that logical thinking about how do you, get this big knot untangled, and where do you start?
Mhm.
And I think I shared one time we were talking about project management, and I said the first time I ever got to use Microsoft Project, back in the day, I went home and told my husband, I'm like, I want to plan my whole life on Microsoft Project because it's just so cool.
I'm a big believer. I love a good chart. I love a good flow chart or a good spreadsheet. And sometimes you can almost do too much and go in that direction where you cease to make it applicable and practical because you're just so focused on, but I have this beautiful
Yeah,
spreadsheet.
yeah, and being in the accounting profession, Excel was the air that I breathed. So to me, it's been a transition to go from that to calendars on the wall and post-it notes and much more visual ways of communicating information. And I think that's part of the fun of training is so many people have different learning styles, and how do we wind through that mix of different learning styles so that the information penetrates into people's psyche. Well, it sounds like you've had a broad range of experience. What type of different entities have you worked with?
Oh gosh, it runs the gamut. Back when I started my career as a fundraiser, I was working with local community-based organizations, and I also was working in a hospital as a grant writer, so had some understanding. And this was back when there was a lot of funding going towards Ryan White and other HIV preventative programs, so areas that I started to learn. And that's when I really started to learn about federal grants and how much work they were, and also sending them in paper copies. So
Oh
you
my
can
goodness.
imagine all of the Xerox copies that went into that. And as a management consultant working with charter schools, and this was in the era of No Child Left Behind, so there was a lot of the federal compliance issues there, and institutes of higher education, national associations, higher education, so you name it, worked with them either as partners or directly as clients or as an employee. So it's been an interesting ride because you learn so much. And what I think is fascinating is that there is a common thread through all of them. So those that are bigger, you think, oh, well, they have things handled, but there's still challenges on that level that some of the smaller ones are dealing with as well, about resources, knowledge, and systems that kind of are pervasive across the board.
Yeah, and when I think back over all the organizations I've worked with, the number one question I get is some version of how do I get people to do XYZ? So it's not really the technical part, which is important. It's really the organizational leadership and management that is the challenge, regardless of your type of organization. It's just so pervasive.
I mean, some of the things that we've heard, and I say there on the pre-award side, there's this focus on building a culture of philanthropy within an organization. And on the post-award, I think it's a culture of compliance that I think needs to be ingrained, that you can't just have that one person be in charge of managing all of the different requirements. That has to be something that's infused into the work
Yeah.
across the board. So.
Yeah, I think the two of us are, like
Oh yeah,
seeing
we're
yeah.
simpatico. Yeah.
What experiences do you think across your career really help you become a trainer?
I would say that I'm going to harken back to my teaching days, because I really do feel that even though there are first graders, there's something about explaining concepts to a younger audience that it really makes you think that just because you know something doesn't mean that the others are going to understand it in the same way. So I always think it's important to simplify and to step back outside of it, because we know that government grants and other things are just filled with jargon. And so we need to kind of take that out. So that was something that was really helpful. And just also working with different clients, because I think that it's helpful to kind of hear the pain points that they're experiencing and trying to infuse that into, the case studies and, just more of the practical knowledge. That it's one thing to just be a trainer and say, okay, here's your checklist of 10 things, now go off and do them, when you know that that could present a challenge. So how do you kind of make it so that that people can understand and actually use the information in a useful way?
Yeah, and I think this is an area that we also another area that we share some common background in, that my parents were both teachers. So even though I said, no, I'm never going to be a teacher, there's no doubt that just being around teachers really and learning their approach to learning
Mhm,
really helped me when I decided to go down this training path to realize the challenge of how do you I think two challenges that I've seen, and I'm sure that you could expound on these as well, is one is the challenge of how do you simplify a complex topic so that
mhm.
people can understand it. And then the second is how do you get people's brains open to learn and meet them where they are, as opposed to, hey, I'm this source matter expert and I know all this stuff and I'm just going to get up and make myself feel better. That's not the task. The task is how do we help the people that we're training with. And one of the examples I always keep in my mind every time I go and train is I did some work with a foster care respite volunteer organization. And a lot of these kids have come out of very difficult circumstances. And we were doing a craft project, and I was working with a young lady who was, probably 7 or 8, who didn't know how to operate a pair of scissors. And I thought to myself, I don't remember anyone ever teaching me how to operate a pair of scissors, but there really is some learning that happens. And if I just went in there and just assumed everyone knew how to operate a pair of scissors, it's kind of like federal grants. If I assume everyone has read the uniform guidance and understands it, that's not a good starting point. We really have to meet people where they are. And that experience really taught me a lot about simplification. And I'm sure you've had some of those life experiences too that really, they say experience is the best teacher. And sometimes it's those bad experiences that teach us the most, or as you said, teach us what we don't want to do. Are there some negative experiences that you might want to share that that really were influential in who you became as a grant professional?
I, I think that, yes. Oh gosh. I mean, that could fill up a whole entire podcast of negative experiences. But I think that, one of the things that I have learned, and I'm sure that you've experienced as well, that I really do feel like people come in with good intentions. And I really do feel like people want to do good work. But I do think sometimes priorities can be a little bit shifted.
Mhm.
So for instance, we working with a client and that's receiving a lot of different COVID relief funding. And the COO says, yeah, I don't really care about compliance. And that's troubling considering the type of entity they are, the type of work that they do in this space. And so hearing something like that and just seeing that kind of trickle down effect that the people underneath have to really support and have to stand up, the organization, because it's not coming down from the top.
Yeah.
So leadership kind of vision, excuse me, and have an impact.
Yeah, and one of the things, being in the accounting profession, I love to talk about internal controls, and I'm sure I get more excited about it than probably most people, but it starts with the tone at the top. And how can we have an expectation of compliance and ethical behavior if it is not modeled at the highest levels of the organization? So it really does. Gravity doesn't stop in the grants world. It flows from the top down. It's still, the laws of gravity still apply. Well, I'm sure we both could spend a lot of time talking about negative stories, but let's put a little positive spin on this. What are some of the best and most exciting things that are you're experiencing working with the grant community right now?
I think that a lot of it is, excuse me, just have a little bit of a tickle. Um, Working with newer organizations that are really excited. And sometimes that can be a challenge, but because they're starting to get from the ground up. But I feel like a lot of them bring in an energy and a passion that makes you excited. So we really love working with those kinds of organizations.
Yeah. And there's so much amazing work going on right now. I think with all of the federal dollars that have come, we're over $1 trillion in federal grants, has just really been such an opportunity in so many ways to solve problems that have not been solved for such a long time. And sometimes people don't believe me. I say
Mhm.
there is more money to solve problems in your community than any time in history. And they'll say, well, yeah, but how do we get them? And what do we do with them once we get them? It's, yeah, that you got to get that first one. And that's really the learning curve for sure. And again, that goes back to leadership. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the different levels of people and things that you typically interact with in your role as a trainer.
And I think a lot of that depends on the size of the organization. So if it's a smaller community-based organization, a lot of times it is the C-suite. You're talking to the COO, excuse me, CFO and the CEO. Other times, especially with it's like a larger institute of higher education or an association foundation, probably more of the grants manager, finance director, that type of thing. And sometimes it's also, especially if we're working on the pre-award side, a lot of that you're talking with the program staff.
Yeah. And I find even in the training through my Fed trainer, what we typically have in any class is people from, very new to grants. They've just, they don't know what they don't know and they feel very overwhelmed, to people who have done it for a long time. And they kind of come in with that, I already know everything. And so
Mhm.
you have to find those little tidbits of either strategy or analysis or things that have changed that engage them as well in a class that can be a pretty wide range of people.
Yeah, and I think also you learn so much from the different types of levels because that's something that we talk about, especially when we think about a needs assessment or developing strategic priorities or even just delegating tasks. You need to understand what the needs are at each level and not have it be a trickle down process. It has to come from a groundswell of what makes sense for the organization as a whole.
Yeah,
So,
it is a very organic flow. And I one of the things I was reflecting on is, as we were kind of discussing, who you deal with as a trainer, who you deal with as a source matter expert, was that whole aspect of credentialing. And as a CPA, I tend to draw CFOs and more the financial staff that's working on supporting programs, where what I see with your certification is you're bringing more the program directors, and those folks are drawn also to the credentialing. So for those of you who are on the fence sometimes about whether it's worth, doing some of this extra professional development, I would just encourage you to think about who do you want drawn into your life, because it really does have an impact on the folks that you draw into your, kind of into your universe as well.
mhm,
And
absolutely.
so I always like to ask, what is that surprising thing about Rachel that people don't know? It's like, what's one thing that you think people might find surprising about your role as a trainer and as a business owner and a wide range of grant professional?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think that I feel like I'm a professional problem solver.
But I don't
But
know what the credential is with that.
and so I think
Yes.
that so much of my time is spent solving problems for my team. If there's a challenge with, a deliverable that we're trying to put together or trying to interpret something that the client is requesting, or if a training attendee says, I have this question, I need an answer for it. So I feel like a lot of my time is always just thinking about how can we help this individual or this organization and just trying to come up with solutions. And of course, you can be as proactive as possible and anticipate some of the questions that arise, but sometimes things just come out and you just have to figure out what makes the most sense and what can help them, as you said before, where they are.
Mhm.
So,
And speaking of that, I bet there's some common mistakes or what I call speed bumps that you commonly see organizations are getting into when they first make that commitment to go after federal grants.
oh my gosh, I call it the shiny object. So, it's kind of like when my kids were younger and you'd have like dang a little toy and they get so excited and you just want to go after it. So they'll forget the existing toys that were around them. It's new and it's shiny. And sometimes I see that as that's what federal grants represent. And so a lot of organizations see that, but then you say, no, 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 but can you manage this grant? Can you be a good steward of funding? This isn't about you. This is about the good for the public. And so I think a lot of the mistakes stem from the lack of planning
Mm,
and foresight. And sometimes, I will say this, especially with a lot of the COVID relief funding and ARPA funding that has come out, sometimes it has just gone to local government agencies and they didn't necessarily ask for it. And so they have this pile of money. And so now they have to do something with it. So I think a lot of it is just figuring out, you know, again, as I said before, people want to do a good job. I feel like people do come in with good intentions, but navigating this complicated information that a lot of government agencies don't necessarily know how to share in a meaningful way with recipients can be a challenge. And so I feel like it's that dialogue and that clarity that's needed to make those educated decisions. That to me is probably the biggest challenge, you know.
and I think that when we look at federal grants, I used to say it was like if someone took someone who had never driven before and put them in a car and said, now you're going to drive 60 miles an hour.
Mhm.
And then all the stimulus happened. And now it's like taking someone who's never driven a car and putting them in a race car and saying, you're going to go 200 miles an hour. And to have an expectation that that person is not going to crash into the wall with absolutely no guidance is just not a very realistic expectation. And so I see that in local governments and, same with nonprofits, because it's all kind of flowing down, is that they have a staff and this money has come to them, which could solve a lot of problems, but people don't have just the fundamental guidance in what are the basics, what things will get me into trouble if I don't pay attention to with federal grants, because they're just being encouraged to go out and spend without really
Mhm.
any development of understanding of the rules or any infrastructure around it.
And I think also just the lack of planning. So if people are just given all this money and they haven't strategically thought about what does our community need, conducting a needs assessment, what would be most helpful, and especially because needs have changed quite a bit in the past 3 years,
Mm.
are we being responsive to the needs now or what we knew before? And so that has I seen that tension as well of just trying to get the money out the door by the deadline, but not necessarily in the best way that it could be
Yeah.
used.
Yeah, and for those of us who were around during the ARA days, we saw that in a smaller,
Mhm.
what I thought was a lot, but now in hindsight, it's kind of the little leagues. But that same pressure to spend, where in hindsight, because there was that lack of planning, there often were not great outcomes with the money that was spent. Well, I
Yep.
always like to give our listeners something they can chew on, a good first step or something like that. Uh, so if someone that is listening is struggling with some of these issues that we're talking about, what do you think would be a good first step for them, especially if they're feeling pretty overwhelmed by what's going on in the grants world right now?
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot of great associations and resources out there. So there's the Grant Professionals Association, there's the National Grants Management Association. They have trainings and there's other consultants and resources out there within those different associations that could be great to kind of learn a little bit more. And I would say from a compliance perspective, the best way to start is to look at the award letters that you have received and start with that. How do you comply with those? Because I know it can be really complicated to kind of look and say, we need to have internal controls across the board, and we don't have this, we don't have that. Start with that, build off of that. What do you need to do to fulfill the terms and conditions and the notice of grant award, and start there. And then you can build off of that. So I think it's good to try to chunk things out. I'm a big believer in chunking out different tasks and prioritizing, because you're not going to be able to create a cash management policy, travel policy, all of these policies within the first 6 months. It's just too hard. And so start with things that make the most sense at that time.
What do you think is the most satisfying part of working in the grant space, and particularly as a trainer?
I think it's the aha moments that people get, that, oh, okay, so this is what that is, or I didn't know that before, and now I know it and I can apply it. I'm a big believer in practical education, as you are as well, and just what are the things that I can grasp, that I can take away with me. Or, we just did an ARPA training recently. And so having people who, similar to what the recipients we were just talking about, and having to comply not only with, state requirements, but federal requirements, and I don't even know where to look. And it's just having that person tell you, this is how you can start, is just a really, for me, it's the most satisfying part of the training process.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have to agree when that little light bulb goes on. And sometimes it's the scary light bulb, but oftentimes it's now I get it. Now this is why they're saying that. Now this is why this is coming up, is that there's that understanding. That's pretty amazing to experience.
Mhm.
Well, we've talked a lot about grants, and Grant Talks is all about talking about grants. Is there a little piece of advice you'd like to share with our listeners as they're moving forward in their grants career, that you can look back in hindsight and go, this was very valuable, and I wished I'd known that sooner?
I think that there's a lot of pressure that grant professionals can put on themselves because of the nature of the work. Because, especially if you're a grant seeker. So I think that stay true to, your values, and stay true to what you know, and start small. And I think that also, it's not all on your shoulders. It has to be a team effort across the board, whether you're a grant writer or a grants manager. So I think it's important to know that, you're not going to get everything the first time. There's going to be mistakes and bumps along the way, but it's really important to just try to ensure that if you can try to move the needle a little bit on that culture of philanthropy or culture of compliance, like, that is a great step in the right direction. And that should be something you should pat yourself on the back.
All right. Thank you for that insight, Rachel. If someone would like to get in touch with you at RBW Strategy, what's the best way to reach out to you?
I am on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Also Twitter. My website is rbwstrategy.com, and email is rachel@rbwstrategy.com. So drop me a line, connect with me. Would love to chat about grants.
And for those of you who'd like to know more about grant training, I encourage you to go out to the MyFedTrainer website, myfedtrainer.com, and learn more about our training options as well. Thank you so much for listening into the Grant Talks podcast. You can find all of the episodes of the Grant Talks podcast out on granttalks.com. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You bet.